The war in Iraq may be polarizing, but all Americans can unite around the idea that soldiers going to war shouldn't also have to fight off unsavory financial salesmen here at home who seek to separate them from their paychecks and their life insurance proceeds. Yet that's exactly what's been happening, fueled, believe it or not, by retired military officers. I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining us today is Diana Henriques, an award-winning reporter from the New York Times, whose explosive stories on these practices created such an outcry that Congress held hearings on them, and a bill outlawing some of these practices is now making its way through the House and Senate. Diana, thank you for being on the show today.
Delight to be here, Sarah.
Can you summarize for us the results of your findings? You did an investigative report for months on this.
Yes, it took quite a while, but we were able to document that unsuitable, expensive financial products, insurance policies and mutual fund programs specifically, but also credit products as well, high-cost loans, and veterans' pension buyouts, were being marketed to the military in many instances by people who were using affinity marketing strategies that employed retired or former military people as the sales force. These products were completely unsuitable for the market, for these, particularly the young soldiers who were heading off to Iraq. Among our findings as well were that these practices had been going on for decades on military bases with the full knowledge of the Pentagon, but that a thoroughly broken enforcement system had just made it impossible to get them fixed.
Can you give us an example of the kind of unsuitable products you're talking about?
Sure. There were young recruits who were hustled into signing insurance policies. Really, most of them thought they were signing up for some kind of savings plan. They didn't realize they were even buying insurance while they were going through basic training at Fort Benning before shipping out to Iraq. The policies cost $100 a month for these young men. They made about $1,100 a month, by the way, and provided in death benefits, if they had been killed, $28,000. Now, by comparison, the military offers low-cost life insurance to these same soldiers, which most of them already had, that allowed them to buy $250,000 worth of death benefit coverage for $16.75 a month. So it was wildly expensive. Now, to be fair, it did include a slow-growing, long-term cash accumulation feature that really gained most of its benefit in the 19th and 20th year of the policy. But that was way over the heads of these young soldiers. Most of them, as I said, didn't even realize they were buying insurance at all.
Now, how did these people get access to the bases and get allowed access to these soldiers?
It was really a breakdown in the base enforcement policies. The Army had rules that said you cannot solicit recruits or trainees during their training program for any kind of commercial sales. But the military is also pressured to be sure it provides some kind of financial or consumer training for young recruits. The training forces were under great pressure to get these kids trained quickly and ready for Iraq duty. So the strains in the system were such that when a couple of local, quote, financial planners offered their services to provide these classes, the sergeants and the troop handlers on base unfortunately took advantage of it. A subsequent investigation led to 11 officers, both commissioned and non-commissioned officers, being reprimanded at Fort Benning for their role in providing access to these troops. But in most cases, it's just inadequate resources to provide legitimate financial training for the recruits, and a very eager pool of salespeople, many of whom are trading on long-time relationships from their own years in the service.
See, that's the part that just completely throws me. I can't imagine how a retired military officer could knowledgeably go in and sell products that were so harmful to these new recruits. How do they explain that to you, and how do they live with themselves?
The ones I was able to interview, in most instances, I think, to give them the benefit of a doubt, genuinely believed that they were providing a service to the troops that the rest of civilian financial service companies were ignoring. I mean, it is manifestly true that military bases get very little attention from the rest of the civilian financial services industry. They're not a particularly attractive market. It's a difficult market to pierce because it's so well insulated and so insular in its relationships. So I think they genuinely felt that they were perhaps providing a service to these military people that was beneficial. In part, however, according to federal regulators, that was based on misinformation that the parent company was providing to its own sales force about the merits of these products.
Now, did you interview the executives of those companies?
At great length.
And how do they justify this as a sensible business practice?
Their arguments were that these high commission products, particularly the mutual fund products that they marketed, which were an archaic form of mutual fund that's completely disappeared from the civilian marketplace more than 25 years ago. But they argued that this particular kind of product, by paying a very high upfront commission, guaranteed that the salesperson would do the kind of coaching and hand-holding that was necessary to turn an uninformed, financially unsophisticated service member into a competent investor. The track record of these products belied that assumption, but that was how they justified it, that this was a high-maintenance kind of selling, and you had to compensate the salespeople to do that.
And how did it affect the returns of the mutual funds to the soldiers?
Well, obviously, if you're losing half of your first year's investment in fees, over 15 or 20 years, that lost money is going to not be part of the nest egg that's growing, and you are inevitably going to have a lower performance than you would if you had had the full amount you were investing earning money over time. That's the great fallacy of this kind of mutual fund. Now, as you mentioned, there are proposals in Congress that would, among other things, finally abolish this form of fund, which regulators have been skeptical about for 50 years. So that's one other piece of unfinished business on the legislative front.
You mentioned regulators. Where were they in all of this?
They were on another planet. I mean, it is true. Planet Military is so insulated from civilian sources of financial information, civilian competitors for financial services, and from civilian regulators. When an incident would occur on a military base, and I documented half a dozen just within the recent couple of years, the last thing in the world that the legal affairs officer on that base would think of to do would be to call the state insurance commissioner's office or federal securities regulators and say, I've got a problem with someone you license.
Why would they not think of that?
They're not in their chain of command. The military culture deals with problems from the bottom up through a very rigidly defined chain of command, and civilian regulators were not part of that. Part of the efforts that have been going on in Congress in the aftermath of my stories is to try to make civilian regulators aware of the need to do active outreach, and conversely to make the Pentagon aware that it has an active responsibility to bring these problems to civilian regulators when they occur.
Let's talk about the Pentagon. You said this has been going on for decades. How do you know that, and what have they tried to do about it?
I know that because Pentagon studies have documented it. That was one of the most astonishing moments in a reporter's life, is when you're digging into something that seems all fresh and new to you, and you stumble across a 5-year-old study that documents that similar problems have been going on for 30 or 40 years. And that they too had been documented by previous studies by the Inspector General for the Defense Department, by the Army Times newspaper back in the 1970s. The longevity of this problem was underscored for us after our stories ran, when we were flooded with emails from readers, a huge number of whom said, the same thing happened to me in Vietnam, the same thing happened to me in the Balkans wars, the same thing happened to my son or my daughter. This was clearly a problem that the Pentagon knew was going on, but its enforcement remedy, the plan it had for dealing with this, was completely inadequate to the scale of the problem.
What was the plan?
Well, the tradition in the military is to push power down to the lowest possible level. The idea being the field commander knows better than somebody up in headquarters what ought to be done today. So the commanding general at each base was essentially responsible for enforcing violations of Pentagon rules governing the sale of financial products on base. Well, as the war began and as the tempo and requirements grew, or as financial resources shrank before wartime, those enforcement procedures were starved. There were many bases I visited where there was a single civilian clerk who was in charge of enforcing this whole body of military rules and trying to keep insurance agents and other salespeople on the straight and narrow. It was broken, and it was especially broken because those base level enforcement people lacked the power to go up against national insurance companies who had strong lobbying presences in Congress.
What was the impact of the lobbying in Congress? What were they doing?
Well, they were essentially protecting their access to bases. That's what the goal of the lobbyists were, was to make sure that Congress did not let the Pentagon pass any rules which would interfere with their ability to sell and solicit for business on base. And they were very successful in doing that.
Is there any attempt at restitution going on? Is there a class action opportunity here?
Both. Actually, there have been some very successful moves towards restitution. I'm delighted to be able to say that almost 1,000 of the young soldiers who were missold life insurance during their basic training at Fort Benning have gotten full cash refunds from the company under pressure from the state regulators in Georgia, who have been very aggressive. In addition, the settlement that the mutual fund sales company, First Command, entered into with the securities regulators required it to make restitution to its customers for excessive sales charges that were paid. That regulatory settlement did not cover all of First Command's customers, however, because of the window of time it covered. So a class action suit has been filed, several which are being consolidated, that will cover the First Command customers who were not covered by the regulatory settlement. So yes, I think some restitution is already being made. I've heard from emails from some very happy soldiers who already have their checks, and further restitution is in the works.
We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time, and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Diana Henriques, reporter for the New York Times. Diana, can you tell us a little bit about an individual soldier or the impact that this might have had on his family, just to make it very concrete for us?
Sure. Well, there was the very interesting case of Nick Stackler and his friends. Now, Nick was a young man from from rural Ohio, who had never been further away from home than his trip to Fort Benning for basic training when he joined the Army right out of high school. He and his classmates were marched into a barracks one afternoon by their troop handler, who then left them in the care of two supposed financial planners. These financial planners gave them a pep talk about the importance of investing, saving for retirement. They all knew they were going to be getting extra money as hazardous duty pay when they went to Iraq, so they signed up for what they thought was some kind of a savings plan, Nick told me. Just sign here, initial here. It was quick-stepped right through. Everybody in the class did it. He thought it was somehow associated with the Army. His mom, Pam Stackler, back in Ohio, watched his finances like a hawk. She had his power of attorney while he was in the Army, and she noticed this $100 payment coming out of his paycheck month after month after month, and she couldn't figure out what it was. She would email or phone him on the occasions they could talk and say, "What is this, Nick? Some kind of savings plan." He wasn't sure. Well, where's the savings going? Well, he didn't know. So she continued to pursue her search. By the time Nick came back home, he was able to discover that it was an insurance company that was getting this money every month. And there was no savings built up. Most of the money had been spent on insurance premiums for coverage he didn't know he had. He never got a copy of the policy. He was completely baffled by the experience and extremely disillusioned. I stumbled across Nick, actually, after a visit to Fort Bragg. A contact there remembered hearing from this mom in Ohio and put me in touch with her. She put me in touch with Nick. He quickly found 6 other buddies from his basic training class who had the same experience. One of them had kept a business card, a little dirty, dog-eared thing that had stayed in his backpack through basic training, through Iraq, up through the Thunder Alley, all the way to Baghdad, and back home again. And he was able to fax it to me. With the name on that card, I was able to trace the company and identify which company it was. Nick was so angry and disillusioned, as were his buddies. They had trusted this representative. They thought it was a representative of the military. It was happening in a classroom in their very own barracks, and they felt betrayed. It was a difficult experience for them, and one that they really despaired of ever getting fixed. So it was quite a thrill to be able to make that right for them.
Now, the Pentagon is attempting to address this problem.
They are, and they've proposed a set of rules which, if they survive the public comment process and are not challenged in Congress, will go a good way, if adequately enforced, towards addressing the problems I found. One of the problems, for example, that we found on base was that the agent's name on that dog-eared business card, well, he wasn't at Fort Benning anymore. He wasn't in Columbus, Georgia anymore. No, soon after he had been caught down there, he packed up his bags and moved to Germany and got approval from military authorities in Germany to sell insurance products on bases there, despite the fact that he had been barred from the base at Fort Benning because of his activities there.
So there's no sharing of information?
No sharing, no central registry, no requirement that there be one. The new Pentagon rules would require the Defense Department to maintain a central registry of rogue agents so that if action has been taken against a company or its sales agent at one base by Army authorities, it will be filed with a central registry so that the Navy base up the road will know to be alert for that agent, and so that action taken against a company by one service branch can be informed. The other services can be informed about that.
I can only assume that the industry is not entirely happy with these new regulations. To what extent can they influence the outcome?
Well, interestingly enough, the larger life insurance industry and the larger securities industry is very much in favor of these tighter rules. The last thing in the world they want is the terrible black eye of appearing to be victimizing people that America holds in their hearts so dearly right now. There have been some instances of resistance, largely to make sure that agents get adequate due process before these sanctions are imposed on them. And I think that there's going to be a little horse trading to make sure that the due process they're entitled to is not so cumbersome and so expensive that a hard-pressed military will just say it's not worth it, which is what has happened with the old broken enforcement system. But there's really not much lobby now for the status quo. It's pretty clear both in Congress and the Defense Department that that's indefensible.
But I think, if I remember correctly, you discovered one instance where I think the Air Force was trying to write some rules or keep somebody at bay, and they were undermined.
The power that these military marketers have with the military is considerable, and I was actually quite surprised to find that prior to my stories running, There had been an effort by the Air Force Legal Assistance Office, some very dedicated young lawyers there who were getting reports from the field from young officers who were concerned about the aggressive sales practices of First Command. They put out a notice on an online listserv for other similar military lawyers on bases around the country, asking for other instances. They were concerned, or do we have a few isolated problems here, or do we have a broader problem? So they put out a call for information. As soon as First Command learned that request for information, not even a full-scale investigation, just a request to the field, had begun, they called the number 2 ranking general in the Air Force and got it stopped. Clearly, they've got access, they've got power, and that made it very unlikely that legal enforcers lower in the ranks were going to be pushing very hard against the sales practices on these bases.
Were you able to interview that general and find out how it's possible that he could restrict that?
Only through email. And his perspective was that all he had done was ask the Judge Advocate General of the Air Force to be sure that this company got a fair hearing. It was at the rank below him that fair hearing was translated into a complete retraction and, in fact, a public apology to the company by the Air Force, which made the Air Force look a little silly after securities regulators had essentially fined and censured the company for exactly the same kinds of practices.
Well, what is going to happen to First Command and other companies that have done this? What are the securities regulators doing?
Well, one of the things they're doing is using some of the money from the settlement with First Command to underwrite a massive education program, consumer education program, solely for the military. The NASD will be overseeing that, and it'll be interesting to see what they develop. Another thing that the companies are doing is promising to do better training. The insurance companies are promising to do better ethics training for their agents and to monitor them more carefully. Again, we need to see how that plays out. They're, in addition, trying to broaden their marketing so that they're not so completely reliant on active duty troops for their sales, which I think would be a healthy development too. Again, it remains to be seen how successful that will be. This is a very rigid and kind of calcified marketplace. It doesn't have a lot of new entries, and the people who are in it are going to really be struggling to figure out how to maneuver in the new regulatory environment.
Why is it that a Fidelity or any of the companies, the Prudentials, why do they not market to the military bases? This is, after all, a sort of captive audience. I would think it'd be sort of very efficient for them. Why is that left to the likes of a First Command?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, First Command would tell you that these civilian companies simply don't understand the culture. They don't understand the pressures that military families are under. They don't understand the frequency, for example, with which they move, the ease with which they must be able to change their addresses and on very short notice. The whole mysteries of the automatic payroll deduction system by which most of these insurance policies and mutual fund policies were paid for is a little baffling to the civilian world, and these military marketers have made a specialty of understanding that. So there are some informational hurdles. There's also some cultural hurdles. The Planet Military is very well insulated from civilian life. And in the post 9/11 security environment, getting on and off base is very difficult for civilians, much more than it had been. So there are some real obstacles to easy access to military consumers.
Although, didn't they get around that themselves by hosting some of these events in motels nearby?
They did, and it would obviously be possible for civilian companies to do the same. What paid for those events off base were the very, very high commissions. Civilian companies don't earn commissions at that rate, and so perhaps they feel that the effort would not be compensated by the money that they can make.
Do you feel that Washington is doing enough? Are you happy with what you're seeing down there?
Well, I'm not entitled to have official opinions. Folks who do editorials and write columns can do that. But I do hear from military families that they're very pleased with the Pentagon's efforts at new rules and will be very disappointed if the industry or Congress are able to water those rules down. There has been a very strong email response from the rank and file that said, we want more protective rules and these look good to us. So certainly the families are looking for more protection. I think given the difficulties the Congress has been facing in this session, there is a strong bipartisan support for getting a solution to this issue soon. And again, a lot of military families will be disappointed if that doesn't happen. So the sense I get is that it's going to be hard to hide this problem away again, to keep it out of the spotlight. So that's encouraging.
And thanks to your good work. We've been fortunate to have New York Times reporter Diana Henriques as our guest today. We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
Rarely does one see such a black and white case of wrongdoing as the one exposed by Diana Henriques in her astonishing stories about predatory financial practices on military bases. Given the nature of these misdeeds, one would expect an immediate response. Yet it took several months for Congress to convene hearings, and here we are almost a year later, and still no comprehensive legislation has been passed to address the problems she identified. Even a relatively modest proposal to raise the ceiling of low-cost life insurance to $500,000 was pared back to a $400,000 cap. But why should there be a cap at all? After all, the soldiers are paying premiums for the privilege. As for the Pentagon, it took 10 months for the agency to propose new rules on who can sell financial products on bases and under what circumstances, and the industry is still trying to fight them. Washington pundits insist this is just how long things take. I say our soldiers deserve better. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.